Right, so I want to talk about Star Wars tonight. Not in the way most channels do it, with the countdowns and the number one will shock you, and someone shouting at you for the first 10 seconds about how this one fact is going to change your entire childhood. None of that. I just want to sit here and go through a big pile of stuff I've collected over the years about this franchise. Some of it's genuinely strange. Some of it's stuff everybody half remembers, but gets slightly wrong in the retelling. The way a story changes a bit every time it gets passed round a pub. And a couple of these are proper, still unresolved mysteries that not even the people who made the films can fully agree on. I'm not going to rank anything tonight. There's no countdown, no, and finally, the biggest one of all. Each story tonight just sits on its own. You can drift off during any of them, and you won't have missed some big reveal at the end, because there isn't one. That's sort of the point. I wanted to make something I could actually fall asleep to myself, which meant cutting out all the stuff that's designed to keep you awake. A bit of housekeeping before I start properly. Some of what's coming up touches on real things that happen to real people, not just plot points in a film. A car crash, a couple of lawsuits, one story near the end about a teenager whose life got turned upside down by the internet before most of us even knew what going viral meant. I'm not going to dwell on the grim parts of any of it longer than I need to, because that's not really what tonight's about. But I wanted to flag it now, rather than catch you off guard later. If you fancy more of this sort of rambling, there's a subscribe button somewhere on the screen. No pressure though, genuinely. I'd rather you just got some sleep. A lot of this came from years of just being the sort of person who reads the credits all the way through, and then goes and reads about the film afterward too, which is a slightly unusual way to spend a Tuesday night, but here we are. None of it's ranked, none of it's urgent, and none of it needs you to remember what happened 5 minutes ago to follow along. Treat it like background chatter from a friend who's read a few too many film history books and won't stop bringing them up. Let's start with the one that almost everyone's heard of, because it's the loudest argument in the entire fandom, and also because the actual story behind it is a bit more interesting than the slogan on the t-shirts. So in the cantina scene in the very first film, Han Solo is sat at a table when a bounty hunter called Greedo turns up, points a blaster at him, and tells him Jabba's not happy about the debt he owes. In the version that played in cinemas in 1977, Han just shoots him. No warning, no exchange of fire. Han's hand comes up from under the table, and that's that. Greedo slumps over. Han tosses some coins at the bartender for the mess and walks off like nothing happened. It's a brilliant little moment because it tells you everything about who this character is without a single line of explanation. He's not a hero. He's a bloke who shoots people who threaten him and doesn't lose any sleep over it. Then in 1997, George Lucas put out the special editions, which were a re-release of the original trilogy with a load of new digital effects bolted on, and one of the changes was to that scene. Now Greedo shoots first and somehow misses Han from about 2 feet away, and only then does Han shoot back. People lost their minds over this. It's still genuinely one of the most argued about single edits in the history of cinema, which is a strange thing to say about 3 seconds of footage, but there you go. What's interesting is why Lucas actually did it. He's talked about this a fair bit over the years, and his reasoning isn't really about making Han look more heroic in some shallow way. He said he was thinking about Han mythologically, like a cowboy, like John Wayne, and his point was that the John Wayne archetype doesn't shoot first. You let the other bloke draw, and then you're faster, and that's what makes you the good guy, by the rules of that kind of story. Lucas has said flat out that he never wanted Han to be a cold-blooded killer, that all his heroes shoot in self-defense, and that when he originally cut the scene back in 1977, he genuinely felt you couldn't quite tell who fired first because of how tight the close-ups were. Now, I'll be honest, I don't really buy that last bit. If you watch the 1977 cut, it's pretty clearly just Han. There's no ambiguity there at all. Greedo never even gets a shot off. And there's actually a script detail that backs this up. An early draft of the screenplay survives, and in that version, Han just shoots Greedo, There's no return fire written in at all. So whatever Lucas intended later, the version that actually got filmed and released was unambiguous. Han shot, full stop. There's also a lovely bit of trivia that nobody involved ever managed to fix, no matter how many times they kept tinkering with the scene over the decades. In every single version, including the original, there's a scorch mark that burns straight through the table when Han fires. But in the special edition, where Greedo supposedly shoots too, his blaster bolt leaves a visible scorch mark on the wall behind Han. So even in the new version, where they're meant to be exchanging fire, only one of them is actually leaving evidence of having fired a weapon. It's a small thing, but I always found it funny. Like the film itself is quietly contradicting its own retcon. Lucas kept adjusting the scene for years after that first change. The 2004 DVD release sped the timing up, so it looked more like they fired at almost exactly the same moment. The 2011 Blu-ray trimmed a few more frames, and then for the Disney Plus release in 2019, they added a line of dialogue from Greedo right before he shoots, a word fans have nicknamed McClunky, which still doesn't really clear anything up. It just adds a slightly odd bit of alien dialogue to a scene people were already annoyed about. So if you've watched the films at different points over the last 20 odd years, there's a decent chance you've genuinely seen 4 or 5 subtly different versions of the same 3 seconds without ever quite realising it. The producer of the original film, a man called Gary Kurtz, has said publicly that the point of the scene was to establish that Han was, in his words, enough of a mercenary that he'd shoot first or end up dead himself. Harrison Ford, when people ask him about it, mostly just shrugs and says he doesn't really mind either way, which I think is the correct response from a man who's had to answer this exact question in interviews for nearly 50 years. What I find genuinely charming about the whole saga is that Lucas himself leaned into it eventually. He wore a t-shirt that said, "Han shot first" on the set of Revenge of the Sith, and again years later on the set of one of the Indiana Jones films. So even the man who made the change, who clearly stood by his reasoning whenever a journalist pushed him on it, was also happy to wear a joke about how much everyone hated that he'd made it. I think that's the most human detail in the whole story. He never backs down on the decision, but he also never pretended people weren't allowed to be annoyed about it. There's a quote from him from 2004 that I think about a lot, where he basically said that the special edition is the version he wants out there, that he's sorry people fell in love with half a finished film, but that he wants it to be the way he wants it to be, which, say what you like about whether it's the right call creatively, is at least a completely honest answer. He's not pretending the original wasn't good. He's just saying it was his to change, and he was always going to. There's a nice bit of trivia about why that whole cantina scene exists in that particular shape in the first place too. Apparently, the actor who played Greedo, a man called Paul Blake, has said the scene was partly born out of a budget problem. An earlier, more elaborate scene introducing Jab, the Hutt in person, had to be cut for cost and schedule reasons, and the Greedo confrontation was reworked to carry some of that weight instead. Funnily enough, when Lucas did eventually restore a version of that cut Jabba scene for the special editions, most people found it a bit pointless, while the scrappy, cheaper Greedo scene it had been built to replace became the iconic one. Sometimes the version you settle for, out of necessity, ends up being the one that actually works. Years later, Lucas gave one more explanation that I think is the calmest version of his reasoning, saying plainly that he never designed Han to be a ruthless killer, that all his good guys shoot in self-defense, and that the trouble with the 1977 cut was simply that the editing was tight enough you genuinely couldn't tell who did what. Whether you buy that or not, fans clearly didn't feel like waiting around for an official fix. There's a whole cottage industry of people who've spent years painstakingly reconstructing the original unaltered theatrical cuts from old film prints and laserdiscs. The most famous being something called Harmy's Despecialized Edition, all to preserve the version Lucas himself has said no longer really exists as far as he's concerned. There's a tiny detail buried in the old expanded novels that I think settles, at least in my own head, what Han's actual personal philosophy on the matter was meant to be, regardless of how any single scene got edited later. In a novel called Han Solo at Star's End, published all the way back in 1979, nearly 2 decades before the special editions existed, Han is given a line where he says he prefers shooting first as opposed to shooting second, which is about as blunt a statement of character as you could ask for. Another book in that same older continuity has a different character, Wedge Antilles, describing the second rule of self-defense as shoot first and ask questions later. So whatever the films themselves ended up showing on screen at any given point, the wider written version of Han Solo that fans had access to for years never had any doubt about who he was underneath it all. Quick one here, since we're already on the subject of Star Wars folklore. Most people assume May the 4th be with you started life as some sort of official Lucasfilm marketing thing, or that it goes back to the original release in 1977. It doesn't. It actually starts in Britain in 1979, and it's got nothing to do with Star Wars fans at all, at least not at first. On the 4th of May that year, Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister. The day before the election, her party workers took out an advert in the London Evening News to support her, and the line they used was, "Dear Maggie, may the 4th be with you, your party workers." Congratulations. Somebody in an ad agency clearly thought they were being terribly clever. And to be fair, it is a decent pun. It's just a slightly mad place for the phrase to first show up in print. There was an actual Star Wars connection sitting right next door though, because The Empire Strikes Back was in production at Elstree Studios at almost exactly the same time that newspaper would have been circulating. So there's a real chance someone working on the film saw that headline over a cup of tea and had a little laugh about it. What I find funny is how long it took the joke to actually become a fan tradition. The phrase pops up in a few scattered places through the late 70s and early 80s. The odd newspaper headline around the 4th of July using it as a gimmick, but it doesn't really become Star Wars Day as we'd recognise it now until 2011, when the Toronto Underground Cinema ran the first organised celebration with a costume contest and a film marathon. So there's something like a 30-year gap between the pun existing and anyone actually building a calendar event around it. It only really took off properly once Star Wars Celebration and other officially backed fan clubs began in the late 1990s, with Lucasfilm sponsoring events long before the Disney acquisition in 2012. There's also a slightly cheeky companion to it that some fans used the day after, the 5th of May, which they call Revenge of the 5th, a play on Revenge of the Sith. It's the sort of thing that only makes sense if you already know the joke, but once you do, it's a nice little piece of fandom logic. The dark side gets its own day right after the light side has had theirs. I like this story because it's such a gentle reminder that a lot of what feels like ancient official Star Wars tradition was actually just one good newspaper pun that took several decades to properly catch on. Nobody planned it. Nobody at Lucasfilm sat in a meeting in 1977 and decided the 4th of May would belong to them. It just sort of accumulated, the way good fan traditions tend to. It's worth saying the pun wasn't even brand new by the time Thatcher's party used it. There's evidence the wordplay was already floating around in 1978, the summer after the first film came out, with newspaper writers occasionally using "May the 4th be with you" as a throwaway gimmick around American 4th of July celebrations, completely unconnected to any election. So the Thatcher advert was really the birth of the joke, the first known and best documented early sighting of it, the one that happened to get written down and therefore survived as the version everyone repeats now. There's also a nice bit of in-house lore where a sound recordist working at Lucasfilm in the early 80s has talked about the phrase doing the rounds informally on set during production, long before anyone outside the company would have heard it. By the time California formally recognized the 4th of May as Star Wars Day in a state legislative resolution a few years back, it had genuinely traveled the full distance from one clever political newspaper pun to government paperwork, which is a fairly remarkable journey for a joke nobody ever copyrighted or owned. The first properly organised public celebration of the day, as opposed to just the phrase popping up in adverts and headlines now and then, traces back to a cinema in Toronto in 2011, which put on a costume contest and a film marathon and basically invented the modern shape of the holiday, almost by accident. Everything since then, the merchandise, the official Lucasfilm involvement, the local council recognitions in various countries, all grew out from that one cinema's afternoon of dressing up and watching films back to back. I quite like that the most corporate, most merchandised day in the entire Star Wars calendar grew from a fan pun, boosted by a slightly cheeky political advert. And decades later, a small independent cinema's idea of a fun Wednesday. I don't think Margaret Thatcher's team had the faintest idea what they were starting either, to be fair to them. They were trying to publish a congratulatory message about an election, not lay the foundations of an annual sci-fi holiday that would eventually get its own merchandise lines and official theme park events on the other side of the world. It's a nice reminder that the things which actually stick in culture are rarely the things anyone sets out to build on purpose. Somebody just makes a decent pun, and 40 odd years later, it's a genuine calendar fixture nobody can quite agree on the true origin of, even with all the documentation sitting right there. There's also something quite nice about the fact that the holiday never really needed a central authority to keep it going. Nobody had to apply for it. Nobody had to get it trademarked or written into a calendar of national observances before people started turning up to cinemas dressed as Wookiees. It just spread the way good in-jokes spread, through people repeating it to each other because it made them smile, which is a fairly rare thing for any piece of internet culture to manage without eventually getting commercialised within an inch of its life. By the time Lucasfilm got properly involved, the day was already theirs in every sense that actually mattered. This one's a proper mystery in the sense that the two people most involved in it told two completely different stories, and neither of them was lying exactly. They just remembered it differently, or maybe just chose to frame it differently. I find that more interesting than a clean answer, honestly. So not long after they finished filming the first Star Wars, before it had even come out, Mark Hamill was in a serious car accident. January 1977, driving alone on a freeway, lost control of the car somehow, and ended up with a fairly badly broken nose and cheekbone. By his own account, years later, he was listening to Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries at the time, cut across 4 lanes to avoid missing his exit, and rolled the car. He'd swapped from one car to another recently, and apparently hadn't quite got used to how much faster the new one could go without him noticing. Because nobody knew yet that Star Wars was about to become the biggest thing in the world, there was barely any press coverage of the crash at the time. He wasn't famous yet, so the records are a bit patchy, and over the years the story's been told slightly differently, depending on who's telling it. Anything from broke his nose and a cheekbone to needed reconstructive surgery on his nose, which feels like exactly the sort of detail that gets more dramatic each time it's repeated at a dinner party. Now, when The Empire Strikes Back came out in 1980, it opens with Luke getting attacked and dragged off by a Wampa, this big Yeti-looking snow creature, and his face ends up scratched and bruised for a chunk of the early film. Fans immediately clocked that Hamill's face looked a little different to how it had in the first film, and the obvious theory was that the Wampa attack had been written specifically to explain away his real injuries on screen. George Lucas has always denied this pretty firmly. On the Blu-ray commentary, he said his feeling was simply that time had passed in the story. The rebellion had been fighting for a while, so a slightly changed appearance felt justifiable anyway, and that the Wampa was mostly there to build tension at the start of the film, rather than to cover for anyone's face. He's also said he told Hamill the same thing privately, years before the commentary, when Hamill apparently asked him outright. But on that very same commentary track, Carrie Fisher tells a completely different version. She says, and I'm paraphrasing slightly here, that his nose had shattered so badly some of his ear cartilage had to be used to help rebuild it, and that the production deliberately wrote in the snow monster early in the film specifically to scratch his face on screen and account for him looking different. So you've got Lucas saying no, and Fisher sitting right there in the same room recording the same commentary, saying basically, yes, make of that what you will. Hamill himself has mostly stayed out of taking a firm side, but in one interview he did let slip that the makeup team building the prosthetics for the Wampa scene used a lot of his actual scars from the crash as the basis for the effect. Which is a strange little detail because it means even if the scene wasn't written because of the accident, his real injuries definitely ended up baked into how the fictional ones looked on screen. There's also a deleted scene, apparently shot but never used, of a droid tending to Luke's wounds after the attack, which suggests the production was at least thinking carefully about how much of his new look they wanted to show and explain. The timeline does complicate the "they wrote it for him" theory a bit, because the first draft of the Empire script was written by Lee Brackett about a year after the crash happened, and Hamill had already done another film in between, without anyone seeming to think his face needed special handling. So it's entirely possible the Wampa was always going to be in there regardless, just for pacing and tension, and the accident only became relevant once they were actually filming, and it was used on screen to help justify what was already there. I quite like that nobody's ever fully resolved this one, including the people who were in the room. It's not really a cover-up or a conspiracy, it's just one of those situations where memory and intention get tangled up after the fact, and everyone involved is being honest about their own version of events. They just don't match. There's even a bit of disagreement about when exactly the crash happened, which I find oddly fitting given how muddled the rest of the story is. Most accounts settle on the 11th of January 1977, but you'll still find some older pieces putting it in December of 1976 instead, presumably just a side effect of how little press attention it got at the time, since Hamill wasn't famous yet, and there was nobody really tracking his movements closely enough to pin the date down with certainty. What we do know is that he was healthy enough to start filming a completely different movie, a light-hearted comedy called Corvette Summer, only about 5 months after the accident, and contemporary photos from that production don't show anything dramatically different about his face, which is one of the stronger arguments against the injuries being severe enough to require a whole new monster subplot built around hiding them. Oddly enough, his co-star on that film, Annie Potts, had survived her own genuinely horrific car accident a few years earlier, leaving her with serious leg injuries. So the two of them ended up working together, having both quietly lived through their own brush with a bad crash, neither one making much of a fuss about it on set. There's a small irony in all this that I don't think gets pointed out enough. Right before the crash, Hamill had just come off a fairly disappointing stretch in his career. He'd starred in a television pilot for a family drama that didn't get picked up by the network for that year's schedule. So by the time Star Wars came along, he was, by his own description, somebody going through a frustrating patch professionally, rather than someone with much of a public profile to protect. Which means whatever did or didn't happen to his face in that crash, it happened to a man nobody outside his immediate circle was paying any attention to yet. 4 months later, Star Wars came out, and within weeks that same unremarkable young actor's face was being studied frame by frame by millions of people who hadn't had any reason to notice it a season earlier. This is one of those bits of Star Wars lore that genuinely doesn't have an official answer, and I don't think that's an accident. I think Lucasfilm have actually gone out of their way to keep it vague, which is unusual for them because normally if fans ask a question enough times, they'll eventually get some tie-in novel or visual dictionary to settle it. So back in The Phantom Menace, we learn that Anakin Skywalker doesn't have a father. His mother Shmi tells Qui-Gon Jinn this very plainly. She says there was no father, she can't explain what happened, she was a slave at the time, and as far as she's concerned, that's just the truth of it. It's framed as something almost miraculous, a virgin birth, which is a strange image for Lucas to reach for, because most of the mythology he'd drawn on up to that point was much more rooted in Eastern philosophy and Joseph Campbell's hero's journey stuff, not really the Christian nativity story. But there it is, deliberately echoed. Qui-Gon takes this as confirmation that Anakin is the chosen one, an old Jedi prophecy about someone who'll bring balance to the Force. Fine so far. Then you get to Revenge of the Sith years later, and Palpatine tells Anakin this story about his old master, Darth Plagueis, who he says was so powerful and so wise that he could use the Force to influence midi-chlorians, the tiny organisms that connect living things to the Force, to actually create life. And he tells this story specifically while trying to seduce Anakin toward the dark side, dangling the idea that this kind of power could stop the people you love from dying. Now that line on its own is suspicious enough, but it gets murkier. There was an earlier draft of that scene where Palpatine says it even more directly, something to the effect that he himself had used the Force to will the midi-chlorians into starting the cell division that created Anakin. That line didn't make the final cut of the film, but it leaked out over the years through behind-the-scenes material, and it became the backbone of an old expanded universe novel that ran with the idea fully, treating it as more or less confirmed that Palpatine, or his old master, had engineered Anakin's birth on purpose, essentially building his own perfect weapon, and then spending years quietly steering him toward becoming Darth Vader. When Disney took over and wiped most of that older material from canon, the question got reopened, and then in 2014 it got reopened again in a much messier way. A Darth Vader comic came out that showed Vader walking through a sort of vision of his own past, seeing his mother pregnant with Palpatine standing right behind her, very clearly implying his hand in the whole thing. Fans took this as basically confirmation. It went everywhere online within about a day, except a member of the actual Lucasfilm story group, a chap called Matt Martin, who'd worked directly on that comic, came out and said publicly that the implication people were reading into it was, in his words, 100% not the intended meaning, and that if the panel had genuinely been meant to show Palpatine directly fathering Anakin, he'd have asked for it to be removed before publication. He clarified that the sequence was intended as something more symbolic, that Palpatine would come to dominate the child's destiny, not that he'd literally created him. So where does that leave us? Honestly, nowhere very definite, and I think that's deliberate. The prevailing canon interpretation seems to be Qui-Gon's original read, that Anakin really was conceived by the Force itself, for its own purposes, to eventually destroy the Sith, which is a slightly poetic, almost self-defeating bit of design, if you think about it. If the dark side really did try to engineer a perfect weapon, and the result is the person who eventually throws the Emperor down a reactor shaft to save his own son, that's either a magnificent irony or just an enormous miscalculation on Palpatine's part, and either reading works depending on how cynical you're feeling about the whole saga that day. What I personally find interesting isn't really which theory is correct. It's that Star Wars, a story that's normally pretty happy to explain absolutely everything to you in painstaking detail, somehow left its single, most important character's origin completely unresolved on purpose. And even when fans practically forced an answer out of them with that 2018 comic, the response was basically, no, please don't read it that way. That's quite a rare thing for this franchise to do. There's an even stranger wrinkle buried in that old, now non-canon expanded universe version of events, which I think is worth a mention purely because of how it flips the whole idea on its head. In that older telling, Plagueis and his apprentice didn't just try to create life on purpose, they actually failed, and the midi-chlorians retaliated by creating Anakin instead. Their experiment to manipulate the midi-chlorians into producing life apparently went nowhere, and wiped out some of their other attempts in the process. The twist was that the midi-chlorians themselves, treated almost as a kind of collective, semi-conscious organism in that version of the lore, were said to have resisted the tampering and then retaliated by engineering Anakin entirely on their own terms, specifically to eventually bring down the Sith who tried to control them. So in that reading, Anakin isn't a weapon Palpatine built at all. He's closer to an immune response, life pushing back against something trying to corrupt it. It's not canon anymore, and it never made it into any film, but I think it's a properly elegant idea, and it's a shame it got quietly dropped along with the rest of that older continuity when Disney took over. It's also worth remembering just how strange a swing this whole idea was for Lucas to make in the first place. Right up through the original trilogy, the mythology he was drawing on leaned heavily toward Eastern philosophy, and Joseph Campbell's writing about myth structures across cultures generally, nothing especially tied to one specific religious tradition. Then with The Phantom Menace in 1999, he reaches for something that's unmistakably the language of a virgin birth, a very particular, very recognisable bit of imagery to borrow. He's never fully explained in interviews why he made that choice at that exact point in the saga, and the resulting tangle of half explanations across 20 years of films, comics and tie-in novels feels to me like the cost of reaching for a powerful symbol without ever fully working out how literally he wanted the audience to take it. I want to talk about a death that didn't actually stick, because Star Wars is full of those, but this one's got a genuinely satisfying explanation behind it, which isn't always true of the others. In Return of the Jedi, Boba Fett, the bounty hunter, everyone had been quietly obsessed with since his first appearance in Empire Strikes Back, despite barely having any lines, gets knocked off Jabba's sail barge during the chaos at the pit of Carkoon and falls into the Sarlacc, this enormous creature buried in the sand with a mouthful of tentacles. Jabba's own description of the thing, translated by C-3PO, is that in its belly you'll find a new definition of pain and suffering as you're slowly digested over 1,000 years. So as far as the film's concerned, that's it. That's the end of Boba Fett, eaten alive by a giant sand monster. No body, no closure, just gone. Except fans never really accepted that, and to be fair, the franchise itself never fully committed to it either. Even back in the old expanded universe days, there were at least two different, slightly contradictory comic and novel explanations for how he'd escaped. In one version, he uses his armor's weaponry and explosives to blast his way free, and ends up severely injuring the creature in the process, which is about as strange as it sounds. In another, completely separate version, he gets pulled back out by a Jawa sandcrawler, only to fall straight back into the Sarlacc a second time in the same story, which always struck me as a fairly inelegant way to bring a character back twice in one go. Then Disney did to this story what they did to the Plagueis, one I mentioned earlier, swept it off the board, and the mystery just sat there unanswered again for years. Boba Fett quietly reappeared in The Man du Law Un in 2020, alive and well, with only a very limited explanation given on screen. Just sort of, here he is, deal with it. Fans had been begging for a proper account of how he survived for literally decades at that point. They finally got one in 2021, in the first episode of the Book of Boba Fett, and the actual answer, once we got it, was satisfyingly grounded compared to the old psychic Bond stuff. He wakes up inside the creature, still alive, finds the remains of a stormtrooper nearby, whose armour still has a working oxygen supply, uses that to keep himself breathing, and then burns his way out through the Sarlacc's stomach wall, using the flamethrower built into his gauntlet. Properly grim image, honestly, but at least it's mechanically sensible, in a way the old Psychic Link version never quite was. It doesn't get easier for him after that either, which I quite like, because it would have been very easy to just have him climb out and immediately be fine. Instead, while he's lying half-conscious in the sand right outside the wounded creature's mouth, a group of Jawas turn up scavenging the wreckage of Jabba's destroyed sail barge, find him, strip his armour off to sell it, and knock him out cold when he tries to stop them. Then a tribe of Tusken raiders find him, take him prisoner, and it's actually years, not minutes, before he gets back on his feet properly and reclaims anything resembling his old life. The armour itself ends up changing hands a few more times before he gets it back, which is its own small saga. I like this one because it's a genuine example of fans asking a question for literally decades and eventually just getting handed a clean, sensible answer on screen, no contradictions, no hedging. Most of these mysteries we're going through tonight stay a bit unresolved by design. This is one of the rare ones where Lucasfilm just sat down and said, right, fine, here's exactly what happened. Here's the stormtrooper's oxygen tank and everything. It's also worth saying the old non-canon comics had a real sense of humour about how silly the situation had become, because fans had wanted Boba Fett back so badly that the explanations started getting a little absurd even by the standards of the genre. In one old comic story, he simply tells another character, almost dismissively, that the creature found him indigestible, which is a brilliantly understated way of brushing off having survived inside a giant sand monster, and his armour's journey after the escape, in the version we eventually got on screen, is its own small adventure. Once the Jawas strip it off him and abandon him in the desert, it eventually passes through several hands, before ending up with a former slave called Cobb Vanth, who uses it to drive off slavers terrorising his town, which means for a stretch of years, Boba Fett's own armour was doing more active good in the galaxy without him in it than it ever did while he was wearing it. What I think is genuinely the most striking part of the whole canon explanation, once you actually sit with it, is just how undignified it all is for someone the films had built up as this legendary, almost mythic bounty hunter. He doesn't escape through skill or cunning or a clever plan. He gets lucky with a dead man's leftover air supply, claws his way out half-blind, gets knocked unconscious by scavengers within minutes of reaching the surface, and then spends years as a prisoner before he's anything resembling himself again, after decades of fans imagining elaborate, heroic ways their favourite mysterious bounty hunter must have survived. The eventual answer Lucasfilm gave them was something closer to sheer dumb luck and a very long, very unglamorous recovery. I actually think that's a braver choice than giving him some clever last-second escape plan would have been. It's worth saying his actual return to the wider story happened slightly before all this got explained too. Luke Skywalker first reappears, fully healed and fully back in his armour, in a brief but very well-received scene right at the end of the second season of the Mandalorian, helping out the title character with no real introduction or context given at the time. Audiences mostly just cheered and asked questions later. The Book of Boba Fett, with its flashbacks finally explaining the Sarlacc escape, didn't actually arrive until after that, which means for a little while, fans got to enjoy the simple fact that he was somehow back before anyone bothered filling in the gap of exactly how. Small one, this. A genuine little mystery that I always found charming precisely because of how minor it was. When The Force Awakens came out in 2015, eyeing up the cast 30 years on from Return of the Jedi, most of the changes were the obvious ones. Everyone's older, the galaxy's a different shape politically, that sort of thing. But there was one tiny detail that a lot of people clocked almost immediately and couldn't quite let go of. C-3P. Who has mostly been gold but with a silver lower right leg for much of his existence, suddenly has one arm that's bright red. No explanation given. Not one line of dialogue about it. He gets a single joke where he tells Han Solo, "You probably don't recognize me because of the red arm," and that's the entire extent of the film addressing it. J.J. Abrams, the director, later said the idea was partly just to mark the passage of time. Droids don't age the way people do, so giving 3PO a visibly different, slightly mismatched part was a quiet way of suggesting decades had passed without anyone having to say so out loud. Fans were not satisfied with that being the whole answer though, because fans never are, and Lucasfilm clearly agreed, because the following year they put out an entire one-shot comic specifically to explain it. Properly committed to the bit, the story has C-3PO crash. Landed on a hostile planet with a small group of resistance droids, escorting a captured enemy droid called Omri, who they need to get back to base because he's got information on where an important resistance figure is being held. One by one, the other droids in the group get picked off as they make their way across the planet, until eventually it's just 3PO and Omri left, the two of them having slowly formed an odd sort of bond despite starting out on opposite sides. 3PO loses his own arm in the chaos at some point along the way, and then near the end, Omri sacrifices himself to save him. So C-3PO takes Omri's arm and fits it onto himself as a kind of memorial, keeping it on rather than getting it repainted to match, as a quiet tribute to a droid who died helping him. It's a surprisingly sweet little story for something that exists purely to explain a continuity quirk nobody, but the most committed fans were actually losing sleep over. By the very end of The Force Awakens, if you look closely, his arm is still red. So whatever sentimental reason he had for keeping it red continued. Or maybe he just figured Luke Skywalker, if he ever did turn back up, would have an easier time recognizing him in his usual colors. I love this one because it's such a tiny, almost throwaway detail, and yet somebody at Lucasfilm decided it deserved a whole standalone comic with an actual emotional arc behind it. That's the kind of overcommitment to detail that I think genuinely defines a lot of this franchise's relationship with its own fans. Ask a small enough question persistently enough, and eventually someone will write you a short story about it. The comic itself actually had a fairly bumpy road to release, which feels appropriate given the subject matter. It was originally supposed to come out in December of 2015, timed right alongside the film itself, but it ended up getting delayed several times and didn't actually reach shelves until April the following year, by which point most of the audience had already seen the film and moved on to arguing about other things. J.J. Abrams, when asked about the decision directly, kept his explanation fairly simple, saying small details like, the arm were really just there to mark the passage of time in a way that didn't need spelling out in dialogue. There's also a slightly daft rumour that's followed the red arm around ever since, that it was a sly nod to a character from a completely unrelated video game who has a matching red prosthetic limb. Nobody involved with the comic has ever confirmed that was intentional, and I suspect it's just one of those coincidences fans enjoy connecting far more than the people who actually made the thing ever intended. What I find quietly funny about the whole episode is the restraint involved on the film's part. They could so easily have given 3PO one line of dialogue explaining the arm right there in The Force Awakens and saved everyone 2 years of speculation. Instead, they let it sit there completely unexplained on screen, trusted the joke about Han not recognizing him to carry the moment, and only quietly resolved it afterward in a format a meaningful chunk of the audience would never even see. It's a strange kind of confidence in your own fan base, betting that people would care enough to go looking for the answer rather than needing it handed to them in the actual film. It's a nice contrast too, with how casually the films usually treat the droids aging in general. Our 2D2 picks up dents and scuffs across the saga without anyone batting an eyelid. BB-8's design just is what it is from the moment we meet him. No explanation required. 3PO's arm is the one bit of droid continuity the franchise ever bothered explaining properly, and I think that's mostly down to him being the most fussy, most self-conscious character in the whole saga. Of course, it would be the droid who's constantly worried about his own dignity, who ends up getting an entire comic dedicated to one slightly mismatched limb. Right, this one's a proper mess, and I mean that almost affectionately, because it's a brilliant example of what happens when a story gets handed off between different writers and directors who aren't entirely on the same page about where it's all heading. When The Force Awakens introduced Supreme Leader Snoke in 2015, he was deliberately mysterious. Massive, hologram projected, scarred, clearly very powerful, clearly pulling Kylo Ren's strings, and the film gives you almost nothing else. No name beyond Snoke. His nature as a Strandcast artificial being is confirmed. His backstory as Palpatine's created proxy is established. That's a completely normal thing to do in a first film of a trilogy. You plant a mystery box, and you trust that somebody, presumably you, has a plan for what's inside it. Andy Serkis, the actor who did the motion capture and voice work for Snoke, was asked about this in interviews around the time, and was pretty insistent that there was a real backstory there, that the character had history, that this wasn't just a vague evil hologram with nothing behind the curtain. The tie-in material that came out alongside the films seemed to back that up too, hinting that Snoke had been around since the days of the Old Empire, that he had mysterious attendants who aided the First Order's navigation through the unknown regions, that whole sort of texture you'd expect from someone building toward a proper reveal. Then Rian Johnson took over for The Last Jedi in 2017, and in one of the most talked about choices of the entire sequel trilogy, he just kills Snoke off about halfway through the film, in a scene that's actually about Kylo Ren rather than about Snoke at all. No explanation for who he really was, no backstory delivered. He's just gone, mid-film, almost as a deliberate statement that the mystery itself wasn't the point, that this was always meant to be Kylo's story rather than a long-form puzzle about some shadowy emperor figure. Some fans loved that as a bold subversion. A lot of others felt cheated, like they'd been promised an answer that never arrived. And then it fell to J.J. Abrams, coming back to direct the third film, The Rise of Skywalker, in 2019, after Rian Johnson's The Last Jedi left several story threads unresolved. His solution, delivered almost as an aside early in the film, is that Snoke was created by Palpatine, who had secretly survived his apparent death at the end of Return of the Jedi. Kylo Ren walks past a row of cloning vats on the Sith world of Exegol containing what are unmistakably more Snoke bodies, suggesting the one we saw on screen for 2 films was just one failed attempt among several. Essentially, a puppet created and operated by Palpatine from a hidden base the whole time. This technically answers the question, but it creates about as many new questions as it solves. If Snoke was just a clone the whole time, why did the earlier visual dictionaries and Andy Serkis himself talk about him having such a distinct personal history? Some of the later tie-in material tried to patch this up by explaining that Snoke wasn't a clone in the traditional sense at all, but something called a strandcast, a genetically engineered being rather than a direct copy, and that Palpatine's experiments kept producing unstable decaying bodies because cloning anyone with real force sensitivity is apparently notoriously difficult, something that gets touched on again later in The Mandalorian when other characters are shown chasing the same problem. There's also a theory, never confirmed but never quite ruled out either, that Snoke's mind was essentially Palpatine acting through him the entire time, which would explain a strange detail in the novelization of The Force Awakens, where Snoke claims to have personally witnessed the rise and fall of the Old Empire, a thing that doesn't really track if he's meant to be a more recently grown creation. Honestly, I think what actually happened here is fairly mundane once you strip the drama away. 3 different filmmakers had 3 different ideas about what Snoke was for. None of them sat down together properly to align it all in advance. And the result is a character whose origin only gets explained in the final film of the trilogy via a single, offhand visual, rather than any real dialogue, patched together afterward, with supplementary books trying to make the pieces fit. It's not really a conspiracy, it's just what happens when nobody locks down the ending of a story before they start telling the beginning of it. The supplementary material that tried to clean this up afterward is genuinely worth a mention because it leans into something quite cold once you actually sit with it. One later book has Palpatine, in his own words, describing Snoke's body as unworthy of containing his dark essence, but useful anyway, calling him a powerful puppet, nonetheless precisely because his natural sensitivity to the Force made him worth keeping around even in a failed, decaying form. So the official explanation isn't just that Snoke was a clone, it's that he was an artificial, strand-cast Palpatine considered beneath him, a flawed prototype, kept on as a tool rather than discarded. There's also a small staging detail that fans clocked almost immediately back when The Last Jedi first came out, that the throne room confrontation between Snoke, Kylo and Rey deliberately echoes the shot composition of the Emperor's throne room scene from Return of the Jedi, right down to some near-identical dialogue. At the time, people read that as homage. With the benefit of hindsight, knowing Palpatine was supposedly steering things from behind the scenes the whole time, it reads a little more like the same architect building 2 very similar rooms 30 years apart. I think the bit of this whole saga that gets overlooked the most is just how unusual it was for Andy Serkis, an actor with a strong reputation for fully fleshed out performance capture work, to be quite so insistent in interviews that there was real substance behind the character, only for that substance to essentially be limited and cut short by the very next film he wasn't directing. It's a reminder that actors, even ones playing the villain at the centre of a trilogy's mystery box, often don't have much more insight into where the wider story is heading than the audience does. He was performing his best understanding of a character whose actual purpose, it turned out, hadn't been fully decided yet by the people steering the larger story around him. There's a small piece of vocabulary worth knowing if you ever go digging into this further. The word strandcast, which is the proper in-universe term for what Snoke technically was, a genetically engineered being rather than a straightforward clone copied from one source. The word itself doesn't actually show up in any of the films. It gets introduced almost in passing in a much later television series, when an unrelated character casually mentions the concept while talking about something completely different. So the actual technical classification of one of the sequel trilogy's central mysteries was quietly slipped into canon years afterward, in a different show entirely, by a character who has nothing to do with Snoke, and probably never even knew the word would end up doing that much explanatory heavy lifting. Quick question to sit with for a second. When a film gets review bombed online, how many of the angry voices are actually real people who just didn't like it? The Last Jedi came out in December 2017, and the reaction to it was, depending on which corner of the internet you were standing in, either mostly positive or absolutely furious. Critics liked it a great deal. A meaningful chunk of the fan base did not, and some of that fan reaction got genuinely nasty, particularly toward the director Rian Johnson personally, and toward Kelly Marie Tran, who played Rose Tico and ended up receiving such a sustained wave of online harassment that she eventually left social media entirely for a while. About a year after the film came out, a research fellow at the University of Southern California, a chap called Morton Bay, published an academic paper looking specifically at the Twitter activity directed at Rian Johnson in the months following the release, and his findings when they made the news got summarized in headlines as something close to "Russian bots ruined The Last Jedi," which I think is a slightly more dramatic framing than what the actual paper said. What Bay's research found, more precisely, was that out of just over 1,200 tweets aimed directly at Johnson that he analysed, around 200 came from accounts he classified as bots, sock puppets, or politically motivated activists, a fair number of whom appeared to be using the film discourse as cover to push entirely unrelated political messaging, much of it tied to far-right talking points around gender, race, or sexuality, rather than anything actually about lightsabers. Of those flagged accounts, 16 showed signs consistent with the sort of coordinated Russian troll activity that had already been documented around the 2016 American election. So when you do the maths properly, that's 16 accounts out of well over 1,000 tweets, not exactly a vast coordinated army, single-handedly tanking the film's reputation, even though that's roughly how the story got passed around online afterward. Bay's broader argument was less about proving the backlash was entirely fake, and more about showing that a noticeable slice of what looked like organic fan anger was actually disguised political activity, using a pop culture argument as a low-stakes battleground to spread something else entirely. Other researchers and journalists who looked closely at his methodology pointed out some fair limitations too. His sample only covered tweets sent directly at Johnson's own account, which leaves out an enormous amount of the wider conversation happening elsewhere, and Bay himself was upfront in the paper that his scope was fairly narrow. What I find genuinely fascinating about this story isn't really the bot's percentage itself. It's what it reveals about how these narratives spread afterward. The version that travelled furthest online wasn't the careful, hedged academic finding. It was the simplified, much more shareable version. It was the Russians all along, because that's a far more satisfying story than a modest fraction of a heated online debate was artificially amplified, and the rest was just genuine, ordinary disagreement among real fans. Both things can be true at once, that some of the loudest voices were fake, and that plenty of people simply did not enjoy the film and said so honestly. Sorting those two groups apart from a distance, just by reading tweets, is genuinely hard, and I think that difficulty is worth sitting with, rather than reaching for whichever version of the story is more dramatic. A few other writers who looked closely at the paper afterward raised a fair point worth including too, which is that Bay's analysis only looked at tweets sent directly at Rian Johnson's own account, a fairly narrow slice of the total conversation happening across the rest of the internet at the time. Someone pointed out that other figures connected to the film, Mark Hamill for instance, were getting plenty of their own mentions and replies that never factored into the study at all, so the actual scale of the problem across the wider fandom is genuinely hard to pin down from this one piece of research alone. None of that means the underlying finding was wrong, just that it was narrower in scope than the breathless headlines suggested. What it does mean is you can't really use Bay's paper to wave away the harassment Kelly Marie Tran went through, which I mentioned a moment ago, because none of the 16 Russian-linked accounts he identified were the whole explanation for that. Genuine fans said genuinely unkind things too. The bots just made an already loud argument louder. They didn't invent it from nothing. What I find oddly comforting about this story, in a strange way, is that it cuts against the simplest version of how we usually think about online pylons. The instinct is to assume either everyone genuinely felt that way, or it was all fake and manufactured. One or the other. A clean explanation either direction. The reality Bay's research points to is messier and, I think, more believable. A real disagreement among real fans, with a smaller but genuinely coordinated layer of bad faith activity riding along on top of it, amplifying the loudest, angriest version of an argument that would have existed in some form anyway. That's a much harder story to tell in a single headline, which is probably exactly why the simpler it was bots all along version is the one that actually stuck. It's also worth saying this wasn't really a new tactic being trialled specifically on Star Wars fans, just a fairly early, well-documented example of something researchers would go on to study across plenty of other fandoms over the following years: video game releases, other franchise sequels, all sorts of online cultural arguments getting quietly used as cover for unrelated political messaging. Star Wars just happened to be big enough, and the backlash loud enough, that it became one of the clearest, most citable case studies people could point to early on. I think that's part of why the story still circulates the way it does. It's less about one specific film, and more become a kind of shorthand example whenever people want to discuss how genuine fan disagreement and manufactured online noise can end up tangled together until it's genuinely difficult to tell which is which from the outside. Solo, a Star Wars story, was meant to be the Han Solo origin film, following him from being a young nobody up through meeting Chewbacca and pulling off the heist that eventually leads into everything we already know about him. Lucasfilm hired Phil Lord and Christopher Miller to direct it, a pair best known for the Lego Movie and 21 Jump Street, films with a very loose, improv-friendly, comedic sensibility. On paper, that's an exciting choice. In practice, it turned out to be a genuinely difficult fit for what this particular film needed to be. Filming started in January 2017, and by around June, after roughly 4.5 months of shooting, getting on for 3/4 of the way through principal photography, Lucasfilm fired them. The official line at the time was simply creative differences, which is the sort of phrase studios use specifically because it tells you almost nothing. But over the following months, in interviews with various cast and crew, a fuller picture started to come out. Apparently, Lord and Miller leaned heavily into improvisation on set, encouraging the actors to play around with scenes rather than sticking tightly to the script, which is exactly the kind of process that made their earlier comedies feel fresh and alive, but which the producers felt was pulling the tone away from what a Star Wars film needed to be. Kathleen Kennedy, who runs Lucasfilm, later said in an interview that she thinks both directors are enormously talented and genuinely funny people, but that their experience came from animation and sketch comedy, where you can improvise freely because the whole process is built around that kind of flexibility, whereas a live-action production of this scale needs a much more locked-down structure just to physically get the work done on schedule with that many moving parts. There was also tension over the writer Lawrence Kasdan, a veteran of the franchise going back to The Empire Strikes Back, being brought onto the London set during filming, which Lord and Miller reportedly felt put them in an awkward position, almost like they were being shadowed by someone checking their work in real time. The editor on the film got swapped out partway through too, which is usually a fairly strong signal behind the scenes that the footage being assembled wasn't landing the way the studio wanted. So Kennedy and the producers brought in Ron Howard, an experienced, steady hand who'd actually worked with George Lucas decades earlier as an actor in American Graffiti. Howard has said that when he first looked at the existing footage, he could see what was bothering the studio, that there was a tonal disconnect between what was being shot and what felt like an actual Star Wars film, though he was honest that he couldn't fully judge from the footage alone whether the underlying approach would have worked once finished. What followed was an enormous amount of reshooting. Howard ended up shooting somewhere around 70% of the finished film, which is why he got sole director credit, while Lord and Miller were given executive producer credits instead. The standard arrangement when a director's work gets mostly replaced partway through. The production extended by months. The budget, originally already substantial, ballooned past $250 million by the time everything wrapped. There was also a recasting forced by the schedule changes. An actor called Michael K. Williams had to drop out because the extended reshoot dates clashed with his obligations to the Red Sea diving resort, and his role was rewritten and recast with Paul Bettany instead. How much of Lord and Miller's original version actually survives in the finished film is something the people involved genuinely disagree about, which I find sort of wonderful. Emilia Clarke has said their fingerprints are all over the final cut, that 90% of her own scenes with them remained largely intact. Paul Bettany, who only joined during the reshoots, has said he thinks Howard reshot considerably more than was originally intended. Donald Glover, playing Lando, mostly stayed out of the reshoot disruption entirely because his big scenes had already wrapped before the change happened. When the film finally came out in 2018, it underperformed at the box office quite badly for a Star Wars release, the first one in the modern era to genuinely be considered a financial disappointment given how much it cost to make. That underperformance is generally credited as one of the main reasons Disney slowed down their plans for more standalone spin-off films after that point. Years later, on a podcast, Lord and Miller talked about the experience with a surprising amount of warmth, despite how publicly messy their exit had been, saying that even though they'd felt deeply misunderstood by how the story got reported at the time, what they actually remember most fondly now is the collaboration itself, working with that cast and crew, rather than the bitterness of how it ended. A few smaller details from the production always stuck with me. Apparently the breakfast meeting where Ron Howard first properly discussed taking over had actually been sitting on Kennedy's calendar for an entirely unrelated reason for over a month before the firing happened, which gives you a sense of how tightly the actual decision came together once it was made. And once Howard was on set directing, George Lucas himself, who by that point had nothing official to do with the franchise anymore, dropped by, apparently meaning to just say a quick hello, and ended up staying for a few hours, offering advice on a scene. There's also a detail about leaked behind-the-scenes photos from Lord and Miller's original version, showing a set for the villain Dryden Voss's base that looked noticeably different from what eventually made it to screen. Different props, a different layout entirely, which suggests at least some of what audiences saw was genuinely rebuilt rather than just lightly touched up during the reshoots. What I keep coming back to with this whole story is how rare it is for a studio to actually let this much of the messy process leak out into public view. Most big productions that go through a director change halfway through filming, get wrapped up tightly in non-disclosure agreements and carefully managed statements, and the public never gets much more than the official creative differences line before everyone involved moves on and stops talking about it. Solo is unusual in that the cast kept being asked about it for years afterward, in promotional interviews, on podcasts, at conventions, and mostly kept answering honestly rather than sticking to a tidy corporate script, which is partly why we have such a detailed, if occasionally contradictory, picture of what actually happened on that set. The film's co-writer, Jonathan Kasdan, son of the veteran Star Wars writer Lawrence Kasdan, has been described in reports as aware of creative differences with Lord and Miller, but has not clearly and directly pushed back on the version of events that puts all the blame on Lord and Miller's improvisational style. He said the real issues were much more practical and structural than people assume, baked into the bones of how the production was being run day to day, rather than purely a clash of comedic instincts versus studio expectations. It's a useful reminder that even with this many people speaking openly about what happened, you still end up with several genuinely different, perfectly sincere accounts of the same 5 months of filming. Back in 2015, off the back of Jurassic World becoming an enormous box office success, Lucasfilm announced that Colin Trevorrow would direct Star Wars Episode 9, the third film of the sequel trilogy. He worked on it during his time as Episode Numimid's director, alongside his regular writing partner, Derek Connolly, producing a script that eventually carried the title Duel of the Fates, named after the John Williams piece of music from the lightsaber duel at the end of The Phantom Menace. Out of everything in tonight's pile, this is the one I find myself coming back to most. Mostly because it's tangled up with one of the saddest bits of real-world timing in the franchise's entire history, which I'll get to in a minute. Then in September 2017, Lucasfilm announced his departure, again saying that their visions for the project differed. Reporting at the time suggested there had been a genuine clash between Trevorrow and Kathleen Kennedy over the direction of the story. There was also some speculation that the poor critical and commercial reception of his other film, that summer, a small drama called The Book of Henry, had shaken confidence in handing him the conclusion to one of the biggest franchises in the world, though nobody involved has ever confirmed that was the actual deciding factor. Whatever the precise reasoning, J.J. Abrams, who'd already directed The Force Awakens, was brought back in to finish the trilogy, working with a co-writer called Chris Terrio, and what eventually reached cinemas in December 2019 was their version, The Rise of Skywalker, with Trevorrow retaining only a story credit for whatever ideas of his had survived into the final product. For a long time, Trevorrow's actual script just sat there as a rumour, what could have been, that fans speculated about without any real detail to go on. Then in January 2020, just a few weeks after the real film had come out to a fairly mixed reception, a full script titled Duel of the Fates surfaced on Reddit. Nobody official confirmed it at first. A filmmaker who'd seen early concept art did a live stream walking through the plot. The script itself followed shortly after, and people noticed that the subreddit it came from had a genuinely strong track record of accurately leaking details from the real Rise of Skywalker before it came out, which gave the new leak a fair bit of credibility right away. Concept art started appearing on image hosting sites too, showing scenes that lined up with the script. Eventually, Trevorrow himself confirmed it was authentic, while also clarifying one detail people had misread, that a piece of art showing R2-D2 looking damaged was meant to show him injured, not actually killed off. The story itself goes in a noticeably different direction from what we actually got. Without spoiling every beat of it, it opens with the First Order having tightened its grip across most of the galaxy, communications between systems largely cut off under Kylo Ren's orders, and General Leia organising one last secret mission to try and turn things around. Finn and Rose end up leading a storyline involving a stormtrooper uprising, something John Boyega, who played Finn, said he found genuinely exciting when the concept art came out, even joking he'd love to see that idea explored as its own series, though he deliberately chose not to read the full script himself, saying he didn't want to put himself through the heartbreak of seeing what might have been. That comment lands a bit harder when you remember Boyega was also fairly vocal afterward about feeling the actual released film had sidelined Finn's storyline in favour of the white leads getting most of the emotional weight. Here's the detail that always gets me though. The leaked script is dated the 16th of December 2016. Carrie Fisher died 11 days after that date, on the 27th of December 2016. So this entire version of the story, built with a substantial role for General Leia at its centre, was written and dated in the final weeks before the actress who played her passed away unexpectedly. It very likely wasn't even Trevorrow and Connolly's truly final draft, just the version that happened to survive and circulate years later. But the timing alone makes reading it feel strange. Like looking at a photograph taken the day before, something changed everything. Reaction to the leak itself was largely positive, with several writers noting it felt like a more direct continuation of the tone Rian Johnson had set up in the last JDI than the film Abrams eventually made. You can also spot a handful of ideas that did make the jump into the real Rise of Skywalker in altered form, suggesting Abrams and Terrio weren't working in a total vacuum from what had come before, just reshaping pieces of it into a different shape entirely. Trevorrow himself has described the project as something close to a practice run for him. His own words, a way of working through how he'd eventually want to close out a franchise he'd genuinely grown up loving. even after he was no longer the one making it. Without listing out the whole plot, a few of the broader strokes are worth a mention because of how differently they land compared to what we got. The opening crawl describes the First Order rising from the ashes of the Empire and threatening the Republic, with Kylo Ren obsessed with finding Luke Skywalker to prevent any organised resistance from forming. Rey's storyline in the real sequel trilogy eventually pushes her toward discovering she's secretly related to Palpatine rather than training a new generation of Jedi. And Leia plays a more limited presence in the Resistance's final plan due to circumstances eventually forced onto the real film. There's concept art showing a Star Destroyer looming over the city planet of Kiar Usant, which never appears in the original trilogy at all. None of it is better or worse exactly, it's just a genuinely different shape for the same ending, which is part of why it's stuck around in fan conversation for years after the actual film came and went. There's something almost touching about how the leak made its way out into the world too. It wasn't dumped all at once by some single source looking to cause damage. It trickled out gradually, a live stream walking through plot details first, then concept art turning up on image sharing sites, then finally the full script itself, each piece building credibility for the next until Trevorrow simply confirmed it rather than continuing to let speculation run wild. That slow, almost archaeological way of a lost version of a story resurfacing piece by piece feels oddly fitting for a franchise that's always been just as interested in its own unmade history as its finished one. Following straight on from that last story, since they're so tied together, I want to talk about the actual practical puzzle the production faced once they knew Carrie Fisher wouldn't be there to film The Rise of Skywalker at all. Fisher passed away in December 2016, a full year before The Last Jedi even came out, so that film had been shot already and didn't need to change anything about her role. But the 9th film, the one originally meant to centre heavily on Leia's story, was a different matter entirely. The studio ruled out the idea of building an entirely computer-generated version of her fairly early on, which is interesting in itself given how far that kind of technology has come, and how it had already been used in a more limited way in Rogue One a few years earlier, for a young version of the character. Instead, the approach they landed on was almost the opposite of generating something new. J.J. Abrams and his team went back through unused footage and outtakes from The Force Awakens, scenes that had been shot but never used, performances that existed but had never made it past the editing room floor. According to Fisher's brother Todd, there was somewhere around 8 minutes of usable Leia footage sitting unused from that earlier film. 8 minutes doesn't sound like much when you're trying to build out a meaningful presence across an entire new movie, but that's genuinely what they had to work with. So the production essentially worked backward. Rather than writing a script and then filming Fisher performing it, which is obviously how it would normally go, they had to take existing lines she'd already spoken years earlier in a completely different context for a completely different scene, and construct new scenes around them that made narrative sense in the new film. Her daughter Billie Lourd, who also has a role in the trilogy, stood in on set during filming, so the other actors had someone physically present to actually react to and make eye contact with. And then visual effects teams had to carefully match lighting, camera angles, and the timing of her movements, so that the old footage of Fisher would sit convincingly alongside scenes filmed years later with actors who'd aged in the meantime. The film's co-writer, Chris Terrio, has been very clear in interviews that despite how technically reconstructed the process sounds, every line Leia speaks in the finished film is something Fisher genuinely said on camera at some point, just recontextualized. He said directly that they didn't use any line she hadn't actually spoken, and that wherever possible, they tried to preserve her original acting intention, even as the surrounding scene changed entirely around her. There's also a fairly remarkable bit of digital work involved in some of the flashback material showing a younger Leia, where her face from Return of the Jedi gets placed onto a different body for new shots, similar to techniques used for the young Leia appearance in Rogue One. Terrio also said afterward that there was meaningfully more usable Fisher footage than what actually made it into the theatrical cut, scenes and moments that got trimmed for pacing reasons, even though he personally liked some of them, suggesting the construction process gave them more raw material to choose from than the 8-minute figure alone might imply, even if a lot of it ultimately ended up as deleted material rather than in the final film. I find this whole story genuinely moving rather than just technically impressive, honestly. It's not really a special effects trick in the way a fully digital character would be. It's closer to a kind of careful archival work, treating an actress's existing, real performances almost like raw material to be respectfully rearranged, specifically so the character she'd spent decades playing could get a proper send-off, rather than just vanishing off screen between films with no explanation at all. Abrams has said that once the footage was assembled, the real test wasn't the technical side at all. It was whether the other actors could make the scenes feel alive, opposite something that was fundamentally recorded years earlier for a different purpose entirely. He's credited the rest of the cast's performances with making it actually land emotionally, rather than just functioning as a clever workaround. It's also worth remembering this wasn't the first time the production had quietly used a version of this trick. A few years earlier, Rogue One had used a young, digitally recreated Princess Leia for a brief appearance at the very end of that film, while Fisher was still alive, built using a body double and visual effects rather than archive footage of her own performance, which gave the effects teams useful groundwork going into the much harder problem of building an entire emotional arc for Leia in The Rise of Skywalker, using nothing but what already existed on file. I think what makes this particular bit of behind-the-scenes work stand apart from most other uses of this kind of technology is the restraint involved. They had the tools available to do far more, to generate new lines entirely, to digitally alter her performance, to fit the new script more neatly, and by every account, they deliberately chose not to. Terrio's insistence that every word audiences hear really did come out of Fisher's own mouth at some point feels less like a marketing line and more like an actual ethical boundary the production set for itself, treating her existing performance as something to be honoured rather than simply mined for raw material. It's also worth saying her family were closely involved in the decision-making throughout, rather than the studio simply doing what it wanted with old footage. Her brother Todd has spoken about being kept informed of how much usable material existed and how the production planned to use it, and her daughter Billie Lourd's involvement on set, standing in for scenes, wasn't just a practical solution. It was also described as a way of keeping someone who genuinely loved Fisher physically present in the process of finishing her story. Whatever you make of the technical side of it, the people actually making the decisions seem to have taken the responsibility of it fairly seriously throughout. This is one of those stories where a single badly chosen joke ends up overshadowing a much more interesting underlying point, and I think it's worth separating the two. When George Lucas sold Lucasfilm to Disney in 2012 for a figure somewhere around $4 billion, he didn't just hand over a back catalogue of finished films. He also had treatments, his own outlines, for what he intended episodes 7, 8 and 9 to actually be about. According to Lucas, he allowed exactly 3 Disney executives to read those treatments before the deal closed. His son Jet said around that time that Lucas had started writing and researching the new trilogy and was, in his words, constantly talking with J.J. Abrams as Abrams came on board to direct the first film. Then somewhere along the way, that working relationship cooled. Lucas has said in several interviews since that Disney looked at his proposed stories and simply decided they wanted to go in their own direction instead, that they wanted, as he put it, to make something for the fans, whereas his own pitch was apparently something closer to what he always considered Star Wars to actually be underneath the surface. Less a story about spaceships, and more what he called a space opera in the soap opera sense, built around family conflict. When that disconnect became clear, by his own account, he simply stepped back and let Disney do their own thing, rather than staying involved and fighting over it. For a while, publicly, Lucas seemed remarkably at peace with this. In a 2015 interview, just before The Force Awakens came out, he said he was actually glad he hadn't seen any of it yet, that not knowing what was coming meant he might finally get to experience being surprised by a Star Wars film the way ordinary audiences always had, something he'd never gotten to do with his own work, because he'd always known exactly what was coming. Then came the Charlie Rose interview, recorded around Christmas 2015, right after The Force Awakens had actually come out. And in it, talking about the characters and the franchise generally, Lucas described them as essentially his children, said he loved them, had created them, was very intimately involved in them, and then, almost as a throwaway aside mid-laugh, said he'd sold them off to what he called the white slavers who take these things. He didn't finish the thought before trailing off into laughter himself, but the comment, understandably, did not land well once it spread online. The backlash was significant enough that within days Lucas issued a public apology, saying he wanted to clarify what he'd meant, acknowledging it had been a poor choice of words for what was, underneath the joke, a genuinely emotional point about losing creative control over something he'd spent 40 years building. What's interesting, looking at the wider run of interviews he gave around that same period, is that this wasn't really a one-off slip. He'd been making variations of the same point, in less inflammatory language, for months beforehand. He compared the whole experience to a divorce more than once, saying that the first rule when you break up with somebody is no phone calls, which is a strangely specific bit of relationship advice to apply to a multi-billion-dollar media acquisition. But it does suggest he genuinely felt the loss of involvement on a personal level, rather than purely as a business matter. It's also worth saying that Lucas hasn't stayed locked into one fixed position on any of this over the years. He's been fairly critical of The Force Awakens specifically, saying at one point that he felt it leaned too heavily on nostalgia for his taste, that he'd always pushed hard to make each of his own films feel genuinely different from the last one, rather than echoing what came before. But in other, calmer interviews, he's also struck a much more conciliatory tone, essentially saying that Disney took the franchise in their own direction, and that's simply how these things go once you sell something you've made. I think the honest read here is that Lucas never fully reconciled how he felt about giving up Star Wars, and that the white slavers comment, badly judged as it was really just the moment all that ambivalence came out, in the worst possible phrasing, rather than some entirely new revelation about how he felt. The apology was genuine. The underlying sense of loss probably was too. What makes the whole thing land a bit oddly looking back is how different his tone was right at the moment of the actual sale in 2012. At the time, he put out a statement saying he was confident that under Kathleen Kennedy's leadership, Star Wars would flourish for generations to come, and that Disney's resources gave Lucasfilm the chance to break new ground across film, television, and theme parks. That's about as warm and supportive a handover statement as you could write. It's only years later, once the actual sequel trilogy was underway, and clearly not following his outline, that the cracks started showing publicly. He's even admitted, in the same stretch of interviews where the white slavers comment happened, that part of why he stepped back, rather than fighting for his vision, was a recognition that Disney weren't especially keen to have him heavily involved anyway, and that if he had pushed his way in, his own words, he'd have just caused trouble, because they weren't going to do what he wanted regardless. That's a man who seems to have talked himself into a peaceful exit that he didn't, underneath it, entirely feel at peace with. What I find genuinely sympathetic about the whole episode, even with the badly chosen joke sitting right in the middle of it, is how relatable the underlying feeling actually is once you strip away the billions of dollars and the global franchise. Most people, at some point, have had to hand something they built over decades to someone else, and then watch that thing change in ways they wouldn't have chosen. A business, a project, sometimes just a family tradition somebody else takes over and quietly does differently. Lucas just happened to be doing it in front of the entire world, with a journalist's microphone in his face, at the exact moment the new owner's first attempt landed in cinemas. This next one's a bit different from everything else tonight, because it's not really about the films at all. It's about a teenager and the very early internet, and Star Wars only really enters the story because of a golf ball retriever. I'll keep this one gentle, because the real parts of it were genuinely hard on the person at the centre of it, and that's worth respecting rather than turning into entertainment. Back in November 2002, a 15-year-old kid from a small town in Quebec called Ghislain Raza filmed himself in a school studio after hours, swinging a golf ball retriever around like it was a double-bladed lightsaber, doing his best Darth Maul impression entirely for his own amusement. Nobody else was meant to see it. He left the tape behind, a classmate found it months later, and by April 2003, it had been digitised and uploaded under a fairly mocking file name. This was before YouTube even existed, before most people had heard the word viral used the way we use it now, so it spread the slow way, through file-sharing networks and early blogs and people emailing it to 5 friends who emailed it to 5 more. It became, by most reasonable accounts, one of the very first true viral videos in internet history. Within a short space of time, it had been edited with lightsaber sound effects, set to music, parodied endlessly, watched what would eventually be reported as something approaching 1 billion times across different versions. And for Raza himself, who hadn't asked for any of it and hadn't consented to any of it being shared in the first place, it became genuinely unbearable. He was mocked relentlessly at school, to the point where the school itself asked him not to come back the following year because of what they called negative publicity, which is a fairly cold way to treat a child who was the victim here, rather than the instigator of anything. Online, the comments got cruel fast, and he's spoken since about how some of them went well beyond mockery into genuinely dangerous territory. His family filed a lawsuit in 2003 against the families of the classmates believed responsible for uploading and spreading it, and that case eventually settled out of court in 2006, just before it would have gone to trial. For a long time after that, Raza deliberately avoided any public connection to the video at all, declining interview requests from various talk shows because he felt, reasonably, that they mostly just wanted to turn him into a kind of circus act rather than treat him like an actual person who'd been through something difficult. What I think makes this story worth including tonight, rather than just leaving as a sad footnote, is what happened afterward. Raza eventually went on to finish school, then went to McGill University, one of Canada's most respected institutions, where he earned multiple law degrees, including a master's in comparative law. In 2013, roughly a decade after the video first spread, he chose to speak publicly about the experience for the first time, specifically because there'd been a wave of cases in the news around then of young people taking their own lives after being targeted by online bullying, and he felt like someone who'd survived an early extreme version of exactly that kind of harassment had something useful to say. His message to people going through something similar has been fairly simple and direct, that you'll get through it, that you're not alone, that there are people who care about you even when it feels like the whole internet is against you. He's since appeared in a documentary about the whole experience, reframing it less as an embarrassing meme and more as one of the earliest and clearest case studies in what cyberbullying actually does to a real person. And if you look at how people talk about the original video now, the tone has genuinely shifted over the years. There's still humour in it. People still find the enthusiasm in that old clip endearing rather than mockable, but there's also a much wider awareness now of what it cost the kid behind it, which feels like a small but real bit of progress for how the internet talks about moments like this. One detail I think is worth including, because it shows the story isn't entirely without kindness in it, involves the blogger who first popularised the video and even gave it its name. He said publicly, looking back, that he deeply regrets posting it, that providing a place for people to pile on was something he can't really take back, even though he didn't write a single one of the cruel comments himself. He and another blogger ended up organising a small fundraiser at the time, collecting around $1,000 to buy Raza an iPod. A fairly modest gesture in hindsight, but a genuine one. And quietly, in the years before he ever spoke publicly about any of this, Raza had already rebuilt a perfectly ordinary, accomplished life away from cameras entirely, including a stint as president of a local heritage preservation society in his hometown, which is about as far from internet meme as a life can get, and I think that's rather the point. The clip itself ended up referenced in passing in all sorts of unrelated places over the years that followed. A quick gag on a sitcom here, a nod in an animated show there, the kind of cultural shorthand that gets absorbed into the wider internet without most people who use the reference ever knowing the real story behind it. I think that's actually the saddest and most ordinary part of the whole thing, not the cruelty itself, which is at least obviously cruel and easy to condemn, but the way something genuinely difficult for one real person quietly became a piece of disposable cultural wallpaper for everyone else, repeated by people who never once paused to wonder how the kid in the footage was actually doing. Right, ending the trivia run with a lighter one. This isn't really a conspiracy or a mystery at all, it's just a genuinely well-argued opinion that's become so widespread among fans that a lot of people now treat it as something close to official, even though it's entirely unofficial and was dreamed up by one bloke on a blog. Back in November 2011, a programmer and Star Wars fan called Rod Hilton, who ran a blog with the rather brilliant name Absolutely No Machete Juggling, wrote a long post arguing that the generally accepted ways of watching the saga, either in the order the films were released or in strict chronological order, starting with the prequels, both have real structural problems. Chronological order spoils the two biggest twists in the entire original trilogy before you even get to them, that Darth Vader is Luke's father, and that Yoda, this tiny green creature on a swamp planet, is actually the legendary Jedi Master who trained Obi-Wan. Release order avoids spoiling those, but it does mean ending the whole saga at the time on a flashback featuring a much younger actor playing Anakin's Force ghost that you, the audience, haven't actually met yet in that version of events. His proposed fix, which he called Machete Order purely because it was the name of his blog rather than for any deeper reason, goes like this. Start with Episode 4, A New Hope, then go straight into Episode 5, Empire Strikes Back, which ends on the big Vader reveal exactly as intended. Then jump backward to Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, and Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, watched essentially as one long flashback explaining exactly how Anakin became Vader, before finally returning to Episode 6, Return of the Jedi, to bring both threads together for the actual ending. Notice what's missing there. Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, gets cut entirely. Hilton's argument is that pretty much everything that film sets up either gets immediately replaced or just doesn't matter to the wider story. Darth Maul is swapped out for Count Dooku as the next film's villain almost the moment Episode 2 starts. And Anakin's transformation from sweet kid to impulsive, power-hungry young man works perfectly well without needing the earlier film as a foundation. As a nice side effect, it also means cutting out a fair amount of Jar Jar Binks and most of the midi-chlorian explanation, two of the more famously unloved elements of the prequels, which I imagine wasn't exactly an accident on Hilton's part. What I find genuinely persuasive about the argument, beyond just dodging the weaker film, is what it does for Yoda specifically. Watching him train Luke on Dagobah immediately after you've just seen him get thoroughly defeated by Palpatine in Revenge of the Sith gives a line like his warning about not underestimating the Emperor's power a completely different weight, because you've literally just watched him lose to that exact threat one film earlier. That sort of resonance simply isn't there if you watch the films in any other order. The post properly caught on. Hilton has updated it himself over the years to account for everything Disney's added since, generally suggesting the sequel trilogy slots in after Return of the Jedi, with non-numbered movies treated as entirely optional extras rather than part of the core sequence at all. It's not something Lucasfilm has ever officially endorsed, and plenty of fans disagree with it for different reasons, including whether cutting Phantom Menace entirely loses something genuinely valuable about Qui-Gon Jinn and that whole opening chapter. But it's a lovely example of fans building their own, completely unofficial canon for how a story should be experienced, purely out of love for getting it right. And having that homemade idea spread so widely, it's now a genuine talking point whenever anyone asks where a newcomer should actually start. There's a fair criticism of the Order that's worth mentioning too, which is what it does to Boba Fett's own arc, if you're watching for the first time. In Attack of the Clones, a young Boba Fett watches his father get killed and quietly picks up his empty helmet, a proper gut punch of a scene that's clearly meant to explain why he grows up into someone so cold and mercenary. If you skip Phantom Menace but still watch the prequels in machete order, that scene lands fine on its own. But it does mean his entire arc then ends, almost immediately afterward in story terms, with him getting knocked into a sand pit in Return of the Jedi and barely getting another line. Some fans have proposed slight variations on Hilton's original idea, sometimes nicknamed things like the Rista Order, which folds Phantom Menace back in as a kind of optional appendix watched later, rather than cutting it entirely, specifically to avoid that slightly anticlimactic stretch for anyone who'd come to actually care about Boba Fett along the way. For what it's worth, I don't think there's a single correct answer here, and I'd be a bit suspicious of anyone who tells you there is. Release Order has its own real charm, watching the effects get more ambitious film by film, watching the culture around the films shift in real time the way it actually happened for audiences at the time. Machete Order is a genuinely clever piece of structural thinking, but it's still just one programmer's opinion from a blog, dressed up in enough confident reasoning that it started to feel like received wisdom. I think the honest answer is that it's worth trying once, purely for the different shape it gives the story, and then going back to whatever order you actually enjoy watching things in afterward. So that's the pile, more or less. Some of it's properly silly, the kind of thing you bring up at a pub quiz and watch people argue about the rules of for 10 minutes longer than the actual answer deserves. Some of it's a bit sadder than I expected when I first started gathering it all together, particularly that one about the kid with the golf ball retriever, which always sticks with me more than I think it's supposed to for a video about a space opera. What I keep coming back to with all of this is how much of it isn't really about the Force or lightsabers at all once you dig in. It's about ordinary, very human stuff happening just off camera, a director getting fired with weeks left on a shoot, an actor's real injuries quietly written into a monster suit, a teenager filming something private that was never meant to leave his house. The films are the bit everyone remembers, but most of what actually stays interesting, to me anyway, is everything that happened around them. There's no neat thread tying all 14 of these together either, and I didn't try to force one in at the end, because that's exactly the kind of thing that would have kept you awake, rather than helped you drift off. Some of it's about luck, some of it's about grief, quite a lot of it's about how messy it is to make anything this big with this many people involved, all under enough pressure that the official version of events and the real one don't always end up matching. If you're still awake at this point, fair play to you. That wasn't really the goal. And if you've already drifted off somewhere around the bit about Boba Fett and the Stormtrooper's oxygen tank, that's exactly what this was for. No rankings, no big finish, nothing you needed to stay alert to catch. Cheers for letting this run in the background tonight. Sleep well.